The Age of Exploration and Early French Voyages. The Age of Exploration was a pivotal period in world history, marking the beginning of global interaction on an unprecedented scale. Emerging in the 15th century and continuing into the 17th, this era saw European nations venture beyond their continental boundaries in search of new trade routes, wealth, and knowledge. Fueled by advancements in navigation, shipbuilding, and a growing curiosity about the world, this movement forever altered the course of human history. Among the prominent players in this transformative era was France, a country that, although slower to enter the age of maritime exploration compared to Spain and Portugal, eventually played a significant role in shaping the New World. French exploration was driven by a mix of economic ambition, national pride, and a desire to expand influence across the globe. Inspired by the success of their Iberian rivals, the French crown supported expeditions aimed at discovering new territories and accessing valuable commodities such as spices, fur, and gold. Unlike the Spanish and Portuguese, who focused heavily on South America and the routes around Africa, the French interest leaned towards North America and parts of the Caribbean. They sought to challenge the dominance of other European powers by forging their own colonies and trade networks. One of the earliest notable French expeditions was led by Giovanni da Verrazzano in 1524. Sailing under the French flag, he explored the Atlantic coast of North America, from what is now North Carolina to Newfoundland, and provided France with its initial claim to parts of the New World. Verrazzano's journey laid the foundation for future French involvement in the continent. His observations of native populations, natural resources, and geographic features were instrumental in generating interest back in Europe. However, his voyage did not result in immediate colonization, as internal political turmoil in France and religious conflicts delayed sustained overseas efforts. A more enduring impact came with Jacques Cartier, who embarked on several voyages in the 1530s and 1540s. Cartier explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence and navigated the St. Lawrence River, reaching as far inland as present-day Montreal. He claimed the region for France, naming it Canada, derived from the Iroquoian word Kanata, meaning village or settlement. Cartier's expeditions marked the beginning of French presence in North America and established a foundation for the future colony of New France. Though initial settlement attempts failed, due to harsh winters and resistance from indigenous peoples, the French continued to show interest in the region. In the decades that followed, French ambitions in the New World grew, focusing particularly on the fur trade. The abundant wildlife in Canada provided lucrative opportunities for French traders and explorers. Relationships with indigenous tribes became central to this enterprise. Unlike some other European powers, the French often relied on alliances and cooperation with native communities. These partnerships were not without conflict, but they enabled the French to navigate unfamiliar terrains and establish trading posts deep into the continent. Samuel de Champlain, often regarded as the father of New France, played a central role in the early 17th century. His explorations and diplomatic efforts led to the establishment of Quebec in 1608, a major foothold for France in North America. Champlain's work set the stage for a more structured and enduring French colonial presence. Under his leadership, the colony began to grow, attracting settlers, missionaries, and soldiers. While expansion was gradual, the French influence in the region became more pronounced. Despite setbacks from hostile environments, conflicts with indigenous groups, and rivalries with other European empires, France continued its explorative and colonial pursuits. By the late 17th century, French explorers like La Salle ventured further south, claiming the Mississippi River basin for France and naming the territory Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. These expansive efforts underscored France's determination to carve out a significant share of the New World. The Age of Exploration was not merely a tale of conquest and discovery, but also of cultural exchange, adaptation, and transformation. Early French voyages contributed to this complex narrative, blending ambition with diplomacy and trade. The French legacy in North America, from Quebec to Louisiana, bears testament to the enduring impact of these early explorers and the vast networks they helped create. Through these voyages, France became an integral part of the global story that unfolded during the transformative centuries of exploration. The rise of New France and the fur trade. The rise of New France and the fur trade marked a significant era in North American history, shaping both the continent's colonial development and its indigenous relationships. Emerging in the early 17th century, New France was established as France's colonial claim in North America, with Jacques Cartier's earlier explorations laying its foundation. However, it was Samuel de Champlain who truly initiated the settlement process by founding Quebec in 1608. This strategic location along the St. Lawrence River became the heart of French colonial ambitions and the center of the burgeoning fur trade that would define the region's economy and political relationships for decades to come. The fur trade became the cornerstone of New France's economy due to the high demand for beaver pelts in Europe, especially for fashionable felt hats. These pelts were highly prized, and the North American wilderness offered an abundant supply. The French quickly realized that cooperation with indigenous peoples was essential for accessing remote trapping regions. Rather than colonizing vast swathes of land as the English did, the French adopted a partnership model with indigenous nations. They formed alliances primarily with the Huron-Wendat and Algonquin peoples, who became vital intermediaries in the trade networks, while also benefiting from access to European goods like metal tools, firearms, and textiles. Unlike the English colonies, which emphasized agriculture and settlement, New France remained sparsely populated, focusing more on commerce and strategic military outposts. The French crown encouraged the spread of Catholic missions alongside the fur trade, believing it would help in civilizing and converting indigenous populations. Jesuit missionaries often traveled with fur traders, documenting indigenous cultures while spreading Christianity. Although some indigenous groups embraced aspects of European religion and goods, they retained their cultural autonomy and often used their alliances with the French to counter rival tribes or European encroachments. The French fur trade system relied heavily on voyageurs and coureurs de bois, independent traders and adventurers who journeyed deep into the forests and river systems. These men established trade routes stretching far beyond Quebec, reaching into the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River. Their interactions with indigenous communities helped weave a vast network of economic and cultural exchanges, although they also introduced new challenges, including disease and shifting power dynamics. Still, the trade relationships often remained more mutually beneficial compared to the more land-hungry English colonies. New France's economic success in the fur trade also attracted the attention of rival European powers, particularly the British and the Dutch. Conflict was inevitable as these empires vied for control of North America's resources. Skirmishes and full-scale wars erupted, such as during the Beaver Wars, where the Iroquois Confederacy, backed by the Dutch and later the British, challenged French and Huron dominance. These violent encounters altered indigenous power structures and forced the French to fortify their military presence, relying more heavily on indigenous alliances for both survival and economic continuity. Despite its reliance on indigenous cooperation, New France never developed into a densely settled colony. Immigration was limited, and harsh winters, coupled with difficult terrain, dissuaded many from relocating. The population remained small, and the economy never diversified significantly beyond the fur trade. However, the colony's influence stretched far and wide due to the mobility of the fur traders and the enduring partnerships they formed. French influence extended through vast tracts of the interior, shaping the cultural and political landscape long after France itself lost control of the territory. Ultimately, New France's fate was sealed during the global conflict known as the 7 Years' War, culminating in the British conquest of Quebec in 1759 and the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which transferred control of French Canada to Britain. Despite the fall of French political rule, the cultural legacy of New France endured in language, law, and local customs, particularly in Quebec. The fur trade continued under British administration, but the uniquely cooperative model established by the French and their indigenous partners left a lasting imprint on Canadian identity and the development of North America. The story of New France and the fur trade remains a testament to how commerce, exploration, and diplomacy shaped a colonial outpost into a vital part of world history. Caribbean and Indian Ocean colonization. The colonization of the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean marked significant chapters in the expansion of European empires. Driven by the pursuit of wealth, strategic advantage, and control over vital trade routes. Beginning in the late 15th century, European powers such as Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, and Britain embarked on ambitious maritime voyages that led to the establishment of colonies across these two distinct but equally significant regions. While differing in geography, culture, and indigenous populations, both regions became deeply entangled in the global networks of commerce, imperial competition, and labor exploitation. The Caribbean, with its myriad islands, was among the earliest targets of European colonization following Christopher Columbus's voyages. Spain quickly claimed vast territories, establishing settlements in places like Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. The initial phase focused on resource extraction, particularly gold, but as the native populations declined due to disease and harsh labor conditions, attention shifted to plantation agriculture, especially sugar. This demand for sugar fueled the transatlantic slave trade, bringing millions of enslaved Africans to work on Caribbean plantations under brutal conditions. The British, French, and Dutch soon followed, carving out their own colonial spheres within the Caribbean. Each power established lucrative sugar-producing colonies, including Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, and Curaçao. The Caribbean became a contested space, with frequent wars and pirate attacks as European powers vied for dominance. Forts were constructed, navies expanded, and the islands became militarized outposts of imperial power. The indigenous cultures and societies that once flourished were largely displaced or destroyed, replaced by a complex social hierarchy dominated by European settlers and maintained through coercive labor systems. The wealth generated from Caribbean plantations contributed to the rise of European economies and was integral to the development of capitalism in the Atlantic world. In the Indian Ocean, European colonization unfolded through a different trajectory, shaped by pre-existing trade networks and powerful local states. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to arrive, seeking a sea route to India and spices from the East Indies. Vasco da Gama's voyage in 1498 opened the gateway to this vast maritime arena. The Portuguese established coastal strongholds in Goa, Malacca, and Mozambique, employing a combination of military force and diplomacy to control key ports and sea lanes. Their dominance, however, was eventually challenged by the Dutch, who formed the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and established a powerful commercial empire centered on Java and the Spice Islands. The Dutch utilized strategic alliances, fortified settlements, and a highly organized trade system to dominate the spice trade, especially cloves, nutmeg, and mace. The British and French also entered the Indian Ocean sphere, founding their own trading companies and competing for influence. The British East India Company gradually extended its reach into India, initially focusing on trade but eventually evolving into a colonial administration with significant political control. The French, though less successful, established important colonies in places like Reunion, Mauritius, and parts of India. Unlike the Caribbean, where plantation economies and slave labor were dominant, Indian Ocean colonies were often integrated into older economic systems and featured a blend of commercial, military, and administrative strategies. Enslaved Africans, South Asians, and Southeast Asians were also transported across this oceanic space, though in different patterns and volumes than in the Atlantic slave trade. Both regions were deeply impacted by European colonization, yet their experiences were shaped by distinct ecological, cultural, and economic contexts. The Caribbean's small island geography allowed for concentrated colonial control, while the Indian Ocean's vast expanse and diverse populations required a more flexible and adaptive imperial approach. Nevertheless, in both areas, colonization led to profound transformations, economic exploitation, cultural displacement, and long-term social stratification. European powers extracted immense wealth, often at the expense of local populations and environments, laying the foundations for modern global inequalities. The legacy of colonization in the Caribbean and Indian Ocean continues to influence contemporary geopolitics, cultural identities, and economic systems. Understanding these histories offers vital insight into the enduring impact of empire and the resilience of communities that survived and resisted foreign domination. The first French settlements in India and Asia trace back to the early 17th century, when France began to expand its overseas ambitions amidst a competitive European colonial landscape. During this time, several European powers, including Portugal, the Netherlands, and Britain, were establishing footholds in the East for trade, particularly in spices, textiles, and other valuable goods. France, under the reign of King Louis XIII and later Louis XIV, aimed to carve out its own influence in Asia, especially in the Indian subcontinent. To do this, the French East India Company was established in 1664, under the guidance of Finance Minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Its main objective was to compete with other European companies and secure profitable trade routes. The earliest French attempts to set up a base in India met with various challenges, including resistance from established colonial powers and the need to build trust with local rulers. Despite initial difficulties, the French managed to establish their first permanent settlement in 1674 at Pondicherry, modern-day Puducherry, on the southeastern coast of India. This location, obtained through negotiations with the local ruler of Bijapur, proved strategic due to its access to trade routes and proximity to rich textile-producing areas. The settlement soon grew in importance and became the administrative centre for French operations in India. In addition to Pondicherry, the French established several other trading posts and settlements along the Indian coastline. Chandernagore, located in Bengal, was acquired in 1673 and became a significant commercial hub for the French in eastern India. Further establishments were made in places like Mahe on the Malabar coast, Yanam near the Godavari River, and Karaikal in Tamil Nadu. These settlements were not contiguous, but scattered across different regions, which eventually proved to be both an advantage for trade and a challenge for defense. French expansion into Asia also extended beyond the Indian subcontinent. The French sought influence in Southeast Asia, particularly in places like present-day Vietnam. Missionaries and traders often laid the groundwork for French presence, which was later followed by more formal colonial engagement in the 19th century. However, in the earlier phases, their involvement was mostly commercial and exploratory. French Jesuit missionaries were active in several parts of Asia, contributing to cultural exchange and diplomatic ties, although these efforts were often met with resistance by local populations or limited by political boundaries. Back in India, French settlements witnessed a mix of growth and conflict. The main challenge came from the British East India Company, which had established its own strongholds in places like Madras and Calcutta. Competition between the British and French in India escalated in the 18th century and eventually led to a series of military conflicts. These included the Carnatic Wars, a sequence of battles in southern India, where both powers allied with local rulers to strengthen their positions. The wars ultimately led to French defeat and significantly curtailed their influence in India, although they were allowed to retain a few trading posts. Despite the setbacks, French settlements in India continued to function and preserve a unique cultural identity. French architecture, administrative systems, and language left a lasting mark in places like Pondicherry, where the legacy is still visible today. The settlements, though small compared to British territories, remained under French control even during periods of global conflict, including the Napoleonic Wars. It was only after Indian independence in 1947 that the question of French territories was formally addressed. Through diplomatic negotiations, the French settlements were integrated into the Indian Union by 1954, bringing an end to nearly 3 centuries of French presence in the subcontinent. The early phase of French settlement in India and Asia highlights both ambition and adaptability. France, arriving later than other European powers, managed to secure its own niche through diplomacy, commerce, and occasionally military engagement. Though they did not achieve the same scale of empire as their British counterparts, their settlements served as important nodes of cultural and economic exchange. The French role in Asia, particularly in India, stands as a testament to the complex interactions between Europe and the East during the age of exploration and colonial expansion. The War of Spanish Succession and France's declining fortunes. The War of the Spanish Succession, fought from 1701 to 1714, was a defining conflict in early 18th century Europe that reshaped the continent's political landscape and marked a significant turning point in France's imperial ambitions. Sparked by the death of the childless Charles II of Spain, the war was essentially a struggle over who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire. Charles had named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of France's King Louis XIV, as his successor. This decision alarmed other European powers, particularly England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire, who feared the unification of France and Spain under a single Bourbon monarchy would tip the balance of power in Europe. Consequently, These nations formed the Grand Alliance to oppose what they viewed as a looming French hegemony. The early phases of the war were characterized by intense military engagements across various fronts, including Spain, the Low Countries, Italy, and Germany. France, initially confident due to its powerful army and experienced commanders, soon found itself overstretched. Although French forces achieved victories in some battles, such as at Luzara and Denain, they also suffered significant defeats, notably at Blenheim in 1704, Ramillies in 1706, and Oudenarde in 1708. These defeats not only weakened French military momentum, but also eroded the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Louis XIV's reign. The brilliance of Allied commanders like the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy played a crucial role in turning the tide against France. Their coordination and tactical genius allowed the Grand Alliance to seize key territories and challenge French supremacy in Europe. Beyond the battlefield, the war placed an enormous strain on France's economy. Years of sustained warfare drained the royal treasury, increased taxation, and caused widespread famine and hardship among the population. The French countryside, already burdened by previous conflicts and poor harvests, suffered further due to the mobilization of men and resources for the war effort. These domestic challenges created discontent at home and undermined the stability of Louis XIV's government. While Louis was able to maintain centralized control, the war made evident the limits of French resources and exposed cracks in the foundations of absolute monarchy. The king, once regarded as the Sunday king, began to face mounting criticism for his expansionist policies and the human and economic toll they exacted. Diplomatically, France found itself increasingly isolated as the conflict dragged on. Despite support from a few allies like Bavaria and Savoy, initially, many of France's former partners either switched sides or pursued their own interests. The shifting alliances and the prolonged nature of the war began to sap the will of all participants. As the war continued, fatigue set in across Europe. The death of Emperor Joseph I in 1711 altered the political calculus for the Grand Alliance, as his brother, Archduke Charles, originally the Allied candidate for the Spanish throne, was now heir to the Holy Roman Empire. This raised fears of a Habsburg monopoly, much like the earlier concerns over a Franco-Spanish union. As a result, peace negotiations gained traction, culminating in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 and the Treaty of Rastatt in 1714. These treaties significantly curtailed French ambitions. Philip V was recognized as King of Spain, but he had to renounce any claim to the French throne, thus preventing the union of the two crowns. Spain ceded a number of its European territories to Austria, Britain, and Savoy, including the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Gibraltar. France also made territorial concessions and agreed to recognize the Protestant succession in Britain. The outcome preserved the balance of power, but underscored the decline of French dominance. Once the most formidable state in Europe, France emerged from the war economically weakened, diplomatically isolated, and militarily humbled. The War of the Spanish Succession thus marked a turning point where France's relentless pursuit of continental supremacy gave way to a more constrained role in European affairs, setting the stage for future upheavals and the eventual decline of the Bourbon monarchy. The 7 Years' War and the end of the First Empire. The 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763, marked a pivotal turning point in global history, reshaping empires, economies, and political ideologies across continents. Often described as the first true world war, it involved most of the great powers of the era, including Britain, France, Spain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. While the conflict began in Europe, its scope extended to North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the Philippines. The war's complexity arose from overlapping rivalries, colonial ambitions, territorial disputes, and dynastic claims merged into a sprawling conflict that tested the resilience and resources of empires. At its core, the 7 Years' War was a contest for supremacy between Britain and France. In North America, it was mirrored by the French and Indian War, where British and colonial troops clashed with French forces and their Native American allies. Britain's naval dominance and more effective use of colonial militias allowed them to seize French territories, including Canada. In India, British forces under the East India Company, led by figures like Robert Clive, capitalized on internal divisions to diminish French influence and lay the groundwork for British colonial rule. These victories expanded British holdings, but also incurred enormous debts, compelling Britain to impose new taxes on its American colonies, setting the stage for revolutionary unrest. Meanwhile, in Europe, Prussia, under Frederick the Great, emerged as a formidable military power despite being vastly outnumbered. With Britain's financial support, Frederick managed to hold off a coalition of Austria, Russia, and France, preserving Prussian sovereignty and altering the balance of power in Central Europe. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formally ended the war, with France ceding vast colonial territories to Britain and Spain. France relinquished Canada and all its claims east of the Mississippi River to Britain, while Spain handed over Florida in exchange for the return of Havana and Manila, previously seized by British forces. Though France retained a few Caribbean islands and trading posts, its global empire was significantly diminished. The consequences of the war were profound and long-lasting. For France, the loss of its colonial empire dealt a heavy blow to national pride and economic stability. The financial strain of the war deepened France's fiscal crisis, a key factor leading to the unrest that culminated in the French Revolution. The monarchy, attempting to recover its stature, undertook costly reforms and military endeavors that only worsened the public debt. Discontent simmered among the populace, particularly as the nobility and clergy maintained privileges while common citizens bore the brunt of taxation. Revolutionary fervor, fueled by Enlightenment ideals, ultimately erupted into widespread rebellion. As the revolution progressed, it gave rise to a new political order, sweeping away the remnants of the feudal monarchy. The First French Republic was established in 1792, signaling the end of centuries of absolute rule. However, internal chaos and external threats prompted the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, a military genius who capitalized on the revolutionary momentum. Under Napoleon, France entered a new phase of expansion and reform, establishing the First French Empire in 1804. His reign brought significant administrative, legal, and social changes, including the Napoleonic Code, which influenced legal systems far beyond France. Yet, the empire's ambitious campaigns overstretched French resources and provoked widespread resistance. The disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 marked the beginning of Napoleon's decline. A coalition of European powers eventually defeated him, leading to his abdication in 1814. Though briefly restored during the 100 Days, his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 brought an end to the First Empire. The Congress of Vienna followed, redrawing the map of Europe and restoring monarchies displaced by Napoleonic rule. The Bourbon monarchy was reinstated in France, symbolizing a return to traditional power structures, albeit under altered circumstances. Thus, the 7 Years' War not only triggered the unraveling of France's global empire, but also set off a chain of events that culminated in revolutionary upheaval and the eventual fall of the First Empire. It redefined power dynamics across continents and revealed the fragility of even the mightiest empires when confronted with the combined forces of war, debt, and societal change. The echoes of that era continue to resonate, shaping modern concepts of governance, nationhood, and international relations. The French Revolution and the collapse of the old order. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, marked a monumental turning point in European history, signaling the collapse of the old order known as the Ancien Régime and the rise of modern democratic ideals. Rooted in deep social, political, and economic inequalities, the revolution was driven by widespread discontent among the French population, especially the Third Estate, which consisted of commoners who bore the brunt of taxation while enjoying few privileges. The rigid class structure had long favoured the clergy and nobility, who were exempt from many taxes and held disproportionate influence over the government and judiciary. This imbalance, coupled with a growing awareness of Enlightenment ideas advocating liberty, equality, and fraternity, fueled a powerful desire for change among the oppressed majority. The financial crisis of the late 18th century further exacerbated tensions. Years of war, including involvement in the American Revolution, had left France deeply in debt. Extravagant spending by the monarchy, particularly under King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, only deepened public resentment. Attempts at reform, such as convening the Estates General in 1789, only highlighted the entrenched power of the elite and the futility of existing political institutions. The Third Estate eventually broke away and formed the National Assembly, signalling a direct challenge to royal authority. This act set in motion a chain of events that would dismantle centuries of monarchical rule. The storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July, 1789, symbolized the people's revolt against tyranny. Though the prison held few inmates, it represented the oppressive power of the monarchy, and its fall was a rallying cry for revolutionaries across the nation. As revolutionary fervor spread, feudal privileges were abolished, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was adopted, proclaiming the universal rights to liberty, property, and security. These declarations laid the ideological foundation for a society based on merit rather than birthright. However, the path to a new order was fraught with challenges, including violent uprisings, political factionalism, and foreign intervention. The monarchy's failure to adapt led to its downfall. Louis XVI's attempted escape and subsequent arrest revealed the monarch's reluctance to cooperate with revolutionary changes. In 1793, both Louis and Marie Antoinette were executed by guillotine, a stark demonstration of the revolution's break with tradition. The revolution entered a radical phase under the Jacobins, who, led by figures like Robespierre, sought to eliminate internal dissent through the Reign of Terror. Thousands were executed during this period, and fear gripped all levels of society. While the aim was to protect the revolution, the excessive violence ultimately led to Robespierre's fall and a more moderate phase. The Directory, which governed France from 1000 1795 to 1799, was marked by instability and corruption. Though it attempted to stabilize the country, it failed to address the root causes of discontent. Amid this turmoil, Napoleon Bonaparte rose to prominence, initially as a military hero and later as a political leader. In 1799, he seized power in a coup d'état, effectively ending the revolution and establishing the consulate. Napoleon's rule would bring stability, but also mark a shift from revolutionary ideals to authoritarian control, even as he maintained some reforms initiated during the Revolution. The French Revolution's impact extended far beyond France's borders. It inspired revolutionary movements across Europe and Latin America and challenged monarchies and traditional hierarchies everywhere. The principles of the revolution, liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty, would become touchstones of modern democratic thought. However, the revolution also revealed the difficulties of implementing these ideals in practice, particularly when power shifts abruptly and violently. It left a lasting legacy of both inspiration and caution. In summary, the French Revolution was a complex and transformative event that dismantled the old order and attempted to build a new society based on reason, justice, and equality. Though marked by bloodshed and turmoil, it fundamentally reshaped France and influenced the course of global history. The fall of the Ancien Régime was not just the end of a monarchy, but the beginning of a new era where the people sought to shape their destiny through collective will and constitutional governance. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most dramatic and influential episodes in European history. Emerging from the chaos of the French Revolution, Napoleon's ascent to power was marked by his military brilliance, strategic cunning, and keen understanding of political dynamics. Born on the 15th of August, 1769, in Corsica, a small island that had recently become part of France, Napoleon's early life was shaped by revolutionary ideas and the turmoil that gripped France during the late 18th century. He entered military school at a young age and quickly distinguished himself with his talent and discipline. As the French monarchy collapsed and the revolution swept through the nation, Napoleon saw opportunities to climb the ranks in the rapidly changing power structure. During the early 1790s, France was at war with several European powers. The revolutionary government needed capable generals, and Napoleon's skill on the battlefield earned him rapid promotions. His success in the Italian campaign of 1796-1797, where he led French forces against Austrian troops, brought him national fame. The victories not only expanded French influence but also showcased Napoleon's ability to inspire troops and outmaneuver larger armies. His leadership style combined fearlessness with strategic insight, and he quickly developed a reputation as a rising star in the French military establishment. Napoleon's ambitions were not limited to military glory. He understood the importance of public perception and cultivated an image of himself as a savior of France. In 1798, he led a campaign in Egypt, hoping to strike a blow against British interests and enhance his reputation. Although the Egyptian campaign had mixed results, it added to his mystique back home. By 1799, political instability plagued France. The Directory, the ruling government, was losing support, and factions vied for control. Sensing an opportunity, Napoleon returned to France and participated in the coup of 18 Brumaire, overthrowing the Directory and establishing the consulate. With this, Napoleon positioned himself as first consul, effectively the leader of France. Under Napoleon's rule, France experienced a period of consolidation and reform. He introduced measures to stabilize the economy, reorganized the administrative system, and established the Napoleonic Code, a unified set of laws that had a lasting impact not only in France but also in other parts of Europe. He also signed a concordat with the Catholic Church, helping to mend divisions caused by the Revolution. These actions endeared him to many in France, who saw in him a leader capable of restoring order and national pride. His popularity continued to grow, and in 1804 he declared himself Emperor of the French, marking the culmination of his rise from a relatively obscure Corsican officer to the ruler of one of Europe's most powerful nations. Napoleon's rise was not without controversy. Critics argued that he betrayed the ideals of the revolution by establishing a new monarchy and concentrating power in his own hands. Yet his charisma, vision, and achievements could not be denied. He redefined leadership and reshaped the political landscape of Europe. His military campaigns over the next decade would redraw borders and challenge the old monarchies, but the foundations of his rule were laid in his early conquests and his ability to adapt to and manipulate the volatile environment of post-revolutionary France. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte was not merely a personal triumph, but a reflection of the transformative era in which he lived. The chaos and opportunity of revolutionary France provided fertile ground for his ambition, and his talents ensured he would not remain a mere participant, but become its central figure. His story remains a powerful example of how individual ability, combined with historical circumstance, can lead to unprecedented power. The journey from Corsican outsider to French emperor was as swift as it was remarkable, leaving an indelible mark on history. The continental system and European domination under Napoleon Bonaparte marked a transformative era in early 19th century history. The continental system, launched in 1806 through the Berlin Decree, was Napoleon's ambitious economic blockade aimed at crippling Britain by cutting off its trade with the rest of Europe. This policy was an alternative to direct military confrontation with Britain, which possessed overwhelming naval superiority following its victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. Napoleon hoped that by isolating Britain economically, he would force it into submission, thereby eliminating his most persistent rival. The intent was to close all European ports to British goods and encourage continental self-sufficiency, but the practical outcomes were far more complex and fraught with resistance. At its core, the continental system sought to assert French control over European trade routes and economies. However, enforcing this blockade across a diverse and resistant continent proved to be a Herculean challenge. Many nations resented France's dominance and often evaded the blockade through smuggling and secret trade agreements. The enforcement of the continental system drew France into further conflicts, expanding its military commitments and heightening tensions with neutral states. It alienated key allies and subjected smaller nations to harsh policies, fueling widespread resentment. Economically, the blockade hurt not only Britain but also France and its allied or satellite states. Many continental industries suffered from the lack of British goods and markets, leading to inflation, unemployment, and economic stagnation in areas previously reliant on trade with the British Empire. Napoleon's vision of a unified Europe under French hegemony faced significant resistance. While he expanded his influence through a combination of military conquests and political alliances, his control often rested on fragile foundations. European domination came at a steep cost, requiring the constant deployment of troops, resources, and administrative efforts to maintain authority. nationalism, which Napoleon had inadvertently helped to foster by spreading revolutionary ideals, began to work against him. In regions such as Spain, Germany, and Italy, local populations resisted French rule, sometimes violently. The Peninsular War in Spain, in particular, drained French resources and morale, becoming a quagmire that symbolized the limits of imperial control. The continental system's failure also revealed the limits of economic warfare. Britain, though inconvenienced, found alternative markets in the Americas, India, and elsewhere. Its industrial base remained strong, and the Royal Navy ensured maritime dominance, enabling Britain to maintain trade through its global empire. Meanwhile, discontent within the European territories under French influence continued to grow. Napoleon's attempts to impose uniformity and compliance disrupted local economies and traditional structures, sparking unrest and weakening loyalty to his rule. The system, instead of solidifying French power, exposed its vulnerabilities and accelerated the formation of coalitions against France. Moreover, the continental system indirectly led to disastrous campaigns, most notably the invasion of Russia in 1812. Russia had grown disillusioned with the system due to its detrimental effects on Russian trade and withdrew from participation. Napoleon's response was to mount a massive military campaign to enforce compliance, leading to a catastrophic failure that marked the beginning of his decline. The harsh Russian winter, extended supply lines, and fierce resistance decimated the Grand Army. This failure emboldened other European powers to rise against Napoleon, sensing a weakening grip on the continent. Napoleon's dream of a Europe united under French rule, economically isolated from Britain, ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The continental system, meant to weaken Britain, ended up weakening Napoleon's own empire. It intensified European opposition, drained economic vitality, and exposed the difficulty of managing a vast and culturally diverse continent through coercion and centralization. By 1815, with the defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon's ambitions were decisively crushed, and the old European order began to reassert itself at the Congress of Vienna. The legacy of the continental system remains a powerful reminder of the complexities of economic warfare and the limits of imperial overreach in the face of local resistance and international opposition. The Spanish Uprising and the Peninsular War. The Spanish Uprising and the Peninsular War were pivotal episodes in the broader context of the Napoleonic Wars, significantly impacting the political landscape of Europe in the early 19th century. The roots of the conflict trace back to 1808, when Napoleon Bonaparte, at the height of his power, sought to tighten his grip over the Iberian Peninsula. Using political manipulation, he forced the abdication of the Spanish Bourbon monarch Charles IV and installed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as the new king of Spain. This move was perceived by the Spanish population as a blatant act of foreign domination, sparking widespread anger and resistance across the country. The Spanish people, who had long been loyal to their native monarchy and deeply connected to their cultural and religious traditions, saw the imposition of a foreign ruler as an intolerable violation of their sovereignty. This sentiment gave rise to an unprecedented wave of popular revolt. Beginning in Madrid on May 2, 1808, known as the Dos de Mayo Uprising. Though the initial revolt was brutally suppressed by French forces, it ignited a nationwide resistance movement that spread rapidly through cities, towns, and rural communities. Spaniards from all walks of life, including peasants, clergy, and aristocrats, took up arms in a patriotic defense of their homeland. Unlike traditional European wars that were fought primarily by standing armies, the conflict in Spain took on the characteristics of a guerrilla war. Spanish fighters, lacking the resources and formal organization of the French military, relied on ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run tactics to harass and weaken the occupying forces. These irregular methods not only frustrated Napoleon's military commanders, but also drained the resources and morale of the French army over time. The countryside became a perilous terrain for French troops, who were constantly vulnerable to sudden attacks by insurgent groups. Meanwhile, the British government, recognizing the strategic importance of Spain in the fight against Napoleonic expansion, allied itself with the Spanish resistance. Under the leadership of Sir Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, British forces landed in Portugal and coordinated military campaigns with Portuguese and Spanish troops. The Peninsular War thus evolved into a larger coalition effort, with the British playing a critical role in organizing and sustaining the military resistance. The harsh terrain and determined opposition made progress difficult for the French, and the campaign in the Iberian Peninsula gradually turned into a costly and protracted conflict for Napoleon. The Peninsular War also had profound political and social consequences within Spain. The collapse of centralized authority in many regions led to the formation of local juntas, or governing councils, that assumed control in the absence of royal power. These juntas not only organized resistance, but also laid the groundwork for political reform and national self-determination. In 1812, the Cortes of Cadiz promulgated a liberal constitution that aimed to modernize Spain's political institutions and reduce the influence of absolutist monarchy. Although this constitution was later revoked, it left a lasting legacy in Spanish political thought and inspired future movements for constitutional governance. As the war dragged on, the French faced mounting difficulties. Logistical challenges, continuous guerrilla attacks, and growing support for the resistance from local populations undermined their ability to maintain control. Additionally, Napoleon's broader military commitments in Central and Eastern Europe weakened his capacity to reinforce his armies in Spain. Over time, the French were driven out of major cities and forced into a defensive posture. The final phase of the war saw a series of decisive victories by the Allied forces, culminating in the withdrawal of French troops from Spain by 1814. The Spanish uprising and the Peninsular War marked a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars, representing one of the first major setbacks to Napoleon's ambitions of European domination. It demonstrated the power of national resistance and popular mobilization in the face of military occupation. The conflict also contributed to the eventual downfall of Napoleon by tying down vast numbers of his troops and depleting the strength of the French Empire. In the broader scope of European history, the war underscored the enduring importance of national identity and the will of the people in shaping the destiny of nations. The Russian invasion and Napoleon's collapse. The Russian invasion marked a critical turning point in Napoleon Bonaparte's military career and ultimately triggered the collapse of his once mighty empire. In 1812, Napoleon launched a massive campaign against Russia, leading what was then the largest army ever assembled in Europe. This Grande Armée, numbering over 600,000 men from various European nations under his control, marched eastward with the objective of compelling Tsar Alexander I to submit to the continental system, an economic blockade aimed at crippling Britain. Napoleon, confident in his previous successes and driven by a desire to reinforce his dominance over Europe, underestimated both the vastness of the Russian terrain and the resilience of the Russian people. The Russian strategy was unlike anything Napoleon had previously encountered. Rather than engaging in large-scale battles, the Russian commanders, particularly General Mikhail Barclay de Tolly and later Prince Mikhail Kutuzov, adopted a scorched earth policy. They retreated deeper into Russia, destroying crops, villages, and supply depots to deprive the French forces of sustenance and shelter. This tactic stretched Napoleon's supply lines to the breaking point and exposed his soldiers to harsh conditions with dwindling resources. Despite this, Napoleon pressed forward, hoping to deliver a decisive blow. The pivotal moment came with the Battle of Borodino in September 1812. Though the French claimed a tactical victory, it came at a terrible cost. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the Napoleonic Wars, with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. Crucially, it failed to break the Russian army's spirit or force a surrender. When Napoleon finally entered Moscow, he found the city largely deserted and set ablaze by its own citizens. There was no triumph, only desolation. With no peace offer from the Tsar and winter approaching, Napoleon faced a dire decision. Reluctantly, he ordered a retreat. This withdrawal became a nightmare. The brutal Russian winter set in with full force, and temperatures plunged. Ill-equipped and demoralized, the French troops succumbed to frostbite, starvation, and ceaseless attacks by Russian partisans and regular forces. Horses died in droves, wagons broke down, and entire units dissolved into chaos. The retreat turned into a horrific death march, reducing the once mighty army to a shattered remnant. Fewer than 100,000 soldiers made it back to friendly territory, and even they were severely weakened. The disastrous Russian campaign shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. News of the catastrophe emboldened his enemies across Europe. Nations that had previously submitted or remained neutral began to rise against him. Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and others joined Russia in forming the Sixth Coalition. Over the next 2 years, they coordinated a series of offensives that steadily drove French forces back. Napoleon, though still a formidable tactician, could not compensate for the sheer scale of opposition and the loss of veteran troops. By 1814, the coalition had invaded France itself. After a string of defeats and the fall of Paris, Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. Though he would briefly return to power during the 100 Days in 1815, culminating in the Battle of Waterloo, the Russian campaign had already sealed the fate of his empire. His aura of supremacy had been irrevocably broken. The invasion of Russia and its aftermath underscore the dangers of overreach in warfare. Napoleon's decision to invade a vast and resilient nation without ensuring sustainable logistics or understanding the depth of national resistance proved to be his undoing. The campaign serves as a stark historical lesson on the limits of military ambition when not aligned with practical strategy. Despite his earlier brilliance, Napoleon's failure in Russia marked the beginning of his decline and the unraveling of his dominion over Europe. In trying to subdue Russia, he instead awakened a tide that would wash away his empire and change the course of European history. The 100 Days and Waterloo. The 100 Days and the Battle of Waterloo mark a dramatic and decisive chapter in European history, encapsulating the final act of Napoleon Bonaparte's meteoric rise and fall. After being exiled to the island of Elba in 1814 following his forced abdication, Napoleon escaped in February 1815 and made a daring return to France. Within a few weeks, he regained control without a single shot being fired, as soldiers and citizens rallied to his side. The period from his return to his final defeat is famously known as the 100 Days. His return sent shockwaves through Europe, where monarchies had just begun to restore the old order after years of Napoleonic rule. Determined to prevent a resurgence of his empire, the major European powers swiftly organized a coalition to bring him down once and for all. Napoleon, ever the strategist, sought to defeat the Allied forces before they could fully unite. He concentrated his army in northern France and marched into what is now Belgium, hoping to divide and conquer the armies of the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian Field Marshal Blücher. On the 16th of June, 1815, he achieved a tactical victory against the Prussians at Ligny, but it came at the cost of delaying his next move. Meanwhile, Wellington's forces withdrew to a ridge near the town of Waterloo, prepared to make a stand. 2 days later, on the 18th of June, the Battle of Waterloo commenced under dark clouds and rain-soaked fields, conditions that played a critical role in the unfolding of events. The battle itself was fierce and unrelenting. Napoleon launched multiple attacks against the Anglo-Allied lines, including a powerful assault on the farmhouse of Hougoumont, which became a pivotal defensive stronghold. Despite intense pressure, Wellington's forces held firm. As the day wore on, Napoleon's famed Imperial Guard made a final push, but it was repelled in a stunning counterattack. The turning point came with the timely arrival of the Prussian army, which struck Napoleon's flank and shattered his lines. Facing encirclement and mounting casualties, Napoleon's army broke and fled the battlefield. Waterloo ended Napoleon's ambitions and restored a fragile balance to Europe. He retreated to Paris, where he abdicated once more and was eventually captured by the British. This time, he was exiled far away to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where escape was impossible. He would live there until his death in 1821, never returning to the continent he once dominated. The defeat at Waterloo was not merely a military loss, it marked the end of an era. The Napoleonic Wars, which had raged for over a decade, were finally over. The Congress of Vienna, already in session, now proceeded with greater confidence in reordering the continent without fear of further French upheaval. The significance of Waterloo extended far beyond France and Britain. It shaped the 19th century political landscape, solidifying the principle of collective security among European powers. The alliance system that followed sought to prevent another widespread conflict, although peace would not last forever. The memory of Napoleon endured, both as a military genius and as a symbol of ambition unchecked by constitutional restraint. His legacy would inspire both admiration and caution in the years to come. The 100 Days showed how quickly power could be reclaimed and how swiftly it could again be lost. For the soldiers who fought, the people who suffered, and the leaders who watched anxiously from afar, the battle served as a powerful reminder of the costs of war and the fragile nature of empires. Today, Waterloo remains etched in historical consciousness as a turning point, not only in French history but in the fate of Europe. It symbolizes the downfall of a once invincible leader and the resilience of coalition forces when united by common purpose. The drama, strategy, and consequences of those final days continue to be studied, commemorated, and reflected upon, standing as a testament to a turbulent time that changed the course of nations. Napoleon III and the birth of the Second Empire. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, later known as Napoleon III, played a pivotal role in shaping 19th century France through the establishment of the Second Empire. Born in 1808, he was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte and carried the weight of a legendary name that held immense appeal among the French people. After years of political exile and failed attempts to seize power, Louis Napoleon capitalized on the political instability that followed the 848 revolution. That year, France witnessed the collapse of the July monarchy, leading to the establishment of the Second Republic. Sensing opportunity, Louis Napoleon returned from exile and entered the political arena with a promise of order, prosperity, and national pride, ideals deeply associated with his uncle's era. His name alone stirred strong emotions, and he successfully cultivated a populist image that resonated with both rural and urban voters. In December 1848, he won the presidential election by a sweeping majority, defeating his opponents with ease. As president of the Second Republic, Louis Napoleon maintained a careful balance between conservative values and progressive reforms, gaining the trust of various factions within French society. However, the Republican Constitution limited him to a single term, a restriction he was unwilling to accept. In December 1851, he orchestrated a coup d'état, dissolving the National Assembly and rewriting the Constitution in his favor. This bold move met with resistance in some quarters but was broadly supported through a national plebiscite. The following year, he cemented his authority by proclaiming the Second French Empire and assuming the title of Emperor Napoleon III. The new regime aimed to restore France's position as a global power, while fostering internal stability and economic development. Napoleon III implemented extensive modernization projects, including the transformation of Paris under Baron Haussmann. The city's narrow medieval streets were replaced with wide boulevards, public parks, and improved sanitation systems, turning Paris into a modern capital emblematic of imperial pride. Beyond urban renewal, his government invested in expanding railways, boosting industrial growth, and promoting agriculture, contributing to a period of relative prosperity and technological advancement. While his authoritarian tendencies curtailed political freedoms, he attempted to justify them with tangible progress and a vision of national grandeur. Foreign policy played a central role in shaping Napoleon III's reign. He sought to reassert French influence across Europe and the wider world, engaging in various military and diplomatic ventures. One of the early successes came with France's involvement in the Crimean War alongside Britain and the Ottoman Empire, countering Russian expansion and bolstering France's standing in Europe. However, not all of his foreign campaigns yielded positive outcomes. The ill-fated intervention in Mexico, where he installed Archduke Maximilian of Austria as emperor, ended in failure and tarnished his reputation abroad. Despite these setbacks, Napoleon III continued to project France as a dominant power committed to upholding national prestige. Domestically, the emperor gradually introduced liberal reforms in the later years of his rule, recognizing the growing demand for greater political participation. These included easing press restrictions, permitting more open debate in the legislature, and allowing opposition candidates to campaign more freely. Nevertheless, these changes could not fully mask the growing discontent among various sectors of French society. Intellectuals, Republicans, and parts of the working class increasingly challenged the empire's authoritarian nature, and questions about its long-term sustainability began to surface. The turning point came with the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, a conflict Napoleon III entered with hopes of strengthening his regime through military victory. However, the war proved disastrous for France. The swift and humiliating defeat at the Battle of Sedan led to the emperor's capture and the collapse of the Second Empire. In the aftermath, the French Third Republic was proclaimed, marking the end of his rule and the Bonapartist dream he had resurrected. Napoleon III was taken prisoner and later went into exile in England, where he died in 1873. Though his empire ended in failure, Napoleon III left a complex legacy. He oversaw significant modernization, contributed to national development, and maintained a vision of French prominence on the world stage. His reign reflected the tensions between authoritarian control and democratic aspirations, between tradition and modernity, the Crimean War and France's return to global power. The Crimean War, fought from 1853 to 1856, marked a significant turning point in European geopolitics and played a crucial role in re-establishing France as a global power under Napoleon III. After decades of diminished influence following the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte, France sought an opportunity to assert its place among Europe's dominant nations. The conflict began as a dispute between Russia and the Ottoman Empire over the rights of Christian minorities in the Holy Land, but it quickly escalated into a broader struggle involving major European powers. France, along with Britain and Sardinia, allied with the Ottoman Empire to counter Russian ambitions, particularly those aimed at expanding influence into the Balkans and threatening access to the Mediterranean. Napoleon III saw the war as a chance to bolster French prestige, strengthen alliances, and reaffirm his leadership on the international stage. His decision to join the conflict was not purely altruistic. It was grounded in a strategic desire to reassert France's status as a key arbiter of European affairs. France's participation was also a message to both domestic and foreign audiences that the country had moved past the instability of previous decades and was ready to act with confidence and strength. The war offered an ideal platform to rebuild national pride and reinforce the legitimacy of the Second Empire. French forces played a prominent role in the Crimean campaign, particularly in the siege of Sevastopol, which became the focal point of the conflict. The operation was long and grueling, characterized by poor logistics, harsh weather, and widespread disease. Despite these challenges, French troops distinguished themselves through determination and tactical effectiveness. The siege eventually ended in Allied victory, significantly damaging Russian fortifications and forcing the Tsarist regime to reconsider its expansionist policies. For France, the outcome represented a military success that restored its credibility in Europe and re-established the country as a central figure in continental diplomacy. The war's conclusion with the Treaty of Paris in 1856 signaled a diplomatic triumph for Napoleon III. The agreement preserved the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire and neutralized the Black Sea, limiting Russian naval power in the region. France emerged from the negotiations as a principal guarantor of European stability, a role it had not held since the early 19th century. The successful outcome validated the emperor's foreign policy and elevated his stature at home, where the war was portrayed as a just cause fought in defense of balance and order. Beyond military achievements, the Crimean War also led to significant changes in warfare and international relations. It was one of the first conflicts to be extensively reported by journalists and photographers, bringing the realities of battle to the public in unprecedented ways. The suffering of soldiers and the inadequacy of medical care sparked movements for humanitarian reform, most notably led by figures like Florence Nightingale. France, too, recognized the need for modernization in its military structure and public health systems. These lessons influenced the empire's approach to future conflicts and reinforced the importance of technological advancement and organization in achieving success. The war also helped solidify France's relationships with Britain and Sardinia, setting the stage for future cooperation in European affairs. For Sardinia, participation alongside France raised its profile and laid the groundwork for Italian unification, an outcome that France would later support. The alliance with Britain, although occasionally strained, created a strategic partnership that balanced Russian and Austrian influence on the continent. France's ability to navigate these complex relationships demonstrated a newfound diplomatic maturity and adaptability under Napoleon III's leadership. While the Crimean War did not resolve all of Europe's tensions, it allowed France to reclaim a leading role in shaping the post-Napoleonic order. The empire's re-emergence on the world stage was no longer a speculative ambition, but a tangible reality supported by military achievement and diplomatic success. It proved that France could engage in international conflict with competence and resolve, reviving the spirit of national unity and global ambition. This period marked a revival of French influence, rooted in both hard power and strategic acumen. In retrospect, the Crimean War was more than a military campaign. It was a defining moment in the evolution of modern France. It showed how calculated intervention and effective alliance building could restore national prestige after years of decline. Napoleon III's gamble paid off, as France once again commanded attention and respect among the great powers. The invasion of Mexico and the failure of imperialism. The invasion of Mexico by France in the 1860s stands as one of the most ambitious yet ultimately futile ventures of European imperialism in the Americas during the 19th century. It was initiated under the rule of Napoleon III, who sought to expand French influence abroad and counterbalance growing American power in the Western Hemisphere. The plan was to establish a friendly regime in Mexico, using financial claims and political instability as justification. Mexico had defaulted on debts owed to European powers, and in 1861, France, along with Britain and Spain, dispatched a joint expedition to demand repayment. However, while Britain and Spain soon withdrew after negotiations, France pursued a deeper, more invasive agenda. Napoleon III envisioned the creation of a Catholic monarchical state that would be allied with France and capable of serving as a regional counterweight to the United States. This grand imperial project quickly evolved into a military occupation, with French forces advancing inland to enforce their objectives. In 1862, the French army suffered a notable setback at the Battle of Puebla, where Mexican forces under General Ignacio Zaragoza repelled their advance. Though the French would later regroup and capture Mexico City, the resistance at Puebla became a symbol of national resilience and is still commemorated as Cinco de Mayo. Undeterred by early resistance, Napoleon III pressed forward, convinced that a European-backed monarchy could take root in Mexican soil. In 1864, Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria was installed as Emperor of Mexico. Backed by French military power and conservative Mexican factions who opposed the liberal government of Benito Juárez. Maximilian's reign, however, was precarious from the beginning. Although he hoped to modernize Mexico and bridge political divisions, his European background and foreign support undermined his legitimacy. He was seen by many Mexicans as a foreign ruler imposed by force rather than by national will. Additionally, the social and political environment in Mexico was highly polarized, and even among conservatives, support for the empire was not unanimous. Meanwhile, Juárez maintained a parallel government and rallied continued resistance against the occupying forces. His cause was bolstered by a strong commitment to national sovereignty and republican ideals that resonated with many citizens. Complicating the situation further was the growing pressure from the United States. Though the US, was embroiled in its own civil war when the French intervention began. By 1865, it emerged victorious and reaffirmed the Monroe Doctrine, which opposed European interference in the Americas. American officials made it clear that the French presence in Mexico was unacceptable, and diplomatic pressure mounted for France to withdraw. Recognizing the shifting geopolitical landscape and the risks of extended conflict, Napoleon III began pulling out his troops in 1866. Without French military backing, the imperial regime quickly lost ground. By 1867, Republican forces regained control of much of the country, and Maximilian was captured, tried, and executed. His death marked a dramatic and final end to the French imperial experiment in Mexico. It was a stark reminder that foreign-imposed monarchies could not succeed without genuine domestic support. The failure of the invasion exposed the limitations of mid-19th century imperialism, particularly in regions where national identity and resistance were strong. For France, it was an embarrassment on the world stage and a blow to Napoleon III's prestige. The campaign drained resources and diminished French credibility, especially in the Americas, where the United States reasserted its influence with renewed confidence. In the broader historical context, the invasion of Mexico serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreach and the misreading of local conditions. While Napoleon III aimed to revive French grandeur through foreign conquest, the venture ultimately revealed the fragile nature of such ambitions. Imperialism, when disconnected from the will of the people and sustained only by military force, could not endure. The collapse of the Mexican Empire demonstrated that genuine authority cannot be imposed from the outside, no matter how noble or strategic the intentions may appear. It reaffirmed the strength of self-determination and left a lasting legacy in the complex relations between Europe and Latin America. The Franco-Prussian War and the fall of Napoleon III. The Franco-Prussian War, fought between 1870 and 1871, marked a defining moment in European history and led directly to the downfall of Napoleon III and the collapse of the Second French Empire. The conflict stemmed from long-standing rivalries and the shifting balance of power in continental Europe. Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia, aimed to unify the German states under Prussian leadership, and a war against France offered the perfect catalyst to achieve that objective. On the other hand, Napoleon III, facing declining popularity at home and eager to reaffirm France's dominance, believed that a military victory could restore his political fortunes. Tensions erupted over the candidacy of a Hohenzollern prince to the Spanish throne, which France saw as a threat to its influence. Diplomatic maneuvering escalated the crisis, culminating in Bismarck's calculated release of the edited Ems dispatch, which inflamed public opinion in both countries and made war inevitable. In July 1870, France declared war on Prussia, expecting a swift campaign and a rally of patriotic support. However, the French military was ill-prepared for a modern conflict. Its organization, logistics, and command structure lagged behind the rapidly modernizing Prussian army, which had been shaped by years of strategic reforms and technological advancements. Prussia and its allies mobilized efficiently, coordinating troop movements and utilizing railway networks to great advantage. French forces, by contrast, were scattered, poorly supplied, and hampered by miscommunication. Early engagements revealed these disparities, with defeats at Wissembourg and Spicheren signaling deeper structural weaknesses. The turning point came in September 1000, 870 with the Battle of Sedan, a disastrous confrontation for the French. Napoleon III personally led the army but found himself surrounded by superior enemy forces. The battle ended in complete defeat, and the emperor was captured along with more than 100,000 soldiers. His capture sent shockwaves through France and signaled the effective end of the Second Empire. Paris erupted in protest, and within days, the government collapsed. The French Third Republic was proclaimed as the country reeled from the sudden loss of its ruler and faced the harsh reality of continued invasion. Despite the fall of Napoleon III, the war raged on. The new Republican government, led by figures such as Leon Gambetta, attempted to rally resistance, organizing fresh armies and encouraging popular mobilization. However, the Prussian advance was relentless. They laid siege to Paris, subjecting the city to months of hardship, starvation, and bombardment. The endurance of the Parisians became a powerful symbol of national defiance, but without effective military relief, the situation grew increasingly desperate. In January 1871, the city surrendered, and shortly after, an armistice was signed. The Treaty of Frankfurt imposed harsh terms on France, including the loss of Alsace and Lorraine and a significant indemnity. For Napoleon III, the consequences were personal and final. He was taken into exile in England, where he lived quietly until his death in 1873. His fall was not only the result of military defeat, but also of a broader failure in leadership and judgment. His decision to go to war had been based on flawed assumptions and overconfidence. The disaster exposed the vulnerabilities of his regime and discredited the imperial system he had constructed. While he had overseen periods of economic growth and modernization during his reign, the war nullified those achievements and cast a shadow over his legacy. The Franco-Prussian War also transformed the political landscape of Europe. It led to the unification of Germany, with Wilhelm I crowned emperor in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, a symbolic act that deeply humiliated France. The emergence of a powerful German empire altered the balance of power and set the stage for future conflicts. France, wounded and resentful, would carry the memory of defeat into the decades that followed, shaping its military and diplomatic strategies. In hindsight, the fall of Napoleon III and the collapse of his empire were not just the result of battlefield losses, but also a reflection of the risks inherent in authoritarian rule dependent on personal authority. The war revealed the limits of imperial ambition and the consequences of strategic miscalculation. It marked the end of an era and ushered in a new chapter in both French and European history, defined by republicanism, rivalry, and the enduring impact of national pride and political transformation. The scramble for Africa and the height of French imperialism. The scramble for Africa represented one of the most intense and rapid periods of colonial expansion in modern history, and it marked the apex of French imperial ambition beyond Europe. During the late 19th century, European powers competed fiercely for control over African territories, driven by a mixture of economic interests, national prestige, strategic motives, and a belief in their cultural superiority. France emerged as a major player in this race for domination, eventually establishing one of the largest colonial empires on the continent. Motivated by both national pride and economic needs, French leaders saw in Africa an opportunity to reclaim global influence, especially after the loss in the Franco-Prussian War and the fall of the Second Empire. The expansion into Africa became not only a project of territorial control, but also a means of projecting French civilization and reinforcing the image of a rejuvenated republic. France began its African conquests earlier than many of its European counterparts, having already established footholds in North Africa, including Algeria, which had been under French control since 1830. By the time the Berlin Conference of 1884–85 formalized the rules of colonial engagement, France was well positioned to extend its influence further into the interior of the continent. The conference, convened to avoid conflict among European powers, effectively legitimized the carving up of Africa without regard for indigenous boundaries, cultures, or existing systems of governance. French officials seized the moment to expand their reach, pushing into West and Central Africa with a series of military campaigns, treaties, and annexations. Over the next decades, France acquired vast territories stretching from the Atlantic coast to the heart of the Sahara and beyond. French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa were administrative groupings that encompassed modern-day nations such as Senegal, Mali, Ivory Coast, Chad, Gabon, and the Central African Republic. In the east, France also gained control of Madagascar and territories around the Horn of Africa. These acquisitions were justified through a doctrine known as the mission civilisatrice, or civilizing mission, which claimed that France had a duty to spread its culture, language, and values to so-called less developed societies. In practice, this translated into extensive control over education, religion, legal systems, and commerce, often with little regard for the wishes or welfare of the native populations. The economic dimension of French imperialism in Africa was equally significant. Colonies were seen as sources of raw materials, including rubber, cotton, palm oil, and precious minerals, which fueled French industries and trade networks. Infrastructure projects, such as railways and ports, were constructed to facilitate extraction and export, though they primarily served colonial interests rather than local development. Forced labor and exploitative taxation systems were imposed to sustain these operations, creating deep social and economic disruptions in many regions. Resistance to French rule was widespread and persistent, met with harsh repression that often left lasting scars on the local communities. Militarily, the French undertook a series of campaigns to solidify their presence, sometimes clashing with rival European powers. One of the most notable confrontations occurred during the Fashoda incident of 1898, when French and British forces nearly came to war in the Sudanese region. Though diplomacy prevailed and France ultimately ceded its claim, the incident highlighted the high stakes and global implications of colonial competition. Despite such setbacks, the sheer scale of French control in Africa by the early 20th century signified the height of its imperial power. The tricolour flag flew over millions of square kilometres, and Paris maintained influence over a vast and diverse array of peoples and territories. Culturally and politically, the African empire reinforced the French sense of identity and global status. Colonial exhibitions in France showcased African artifacts and peoples, reflecting both fascination and a belief in national superiority. The empire was presented as a symbol of progress and achievement, even as critics at home and abroad questioned the moral and practical costs of such dominance. Over time, however, maintaining the empire became increasingly challenging. Nationalist movements began to grow within the colonies, and global attitudes toward imperialism started to shift. Still, during the height of the scramble for Africa, France stood as a dominant force, deeply entrenched in the colonial order that reshaped continents and defined an era of ambition, conflict, and profound transformation. Resistance and rebellion in the colonies. Resistance and rebellion in the colonies formed a central part of the colonial experience, challenging the narrative of unopposed imperial dominance. Throughout the Age of Empire, colonized peoples across Africa, Asia, and other regions engaged in active defiance against foreign rule. These acts of resistance were driven by various factors, including the loss of sovereignty, exploitation, cultural imposition, and harsh economic policies enforced by colonial administrations. From the earliest moments of occupation, indigenous populations opposed the erosion of their traditional ways of life, political structures, and religious beliefs. The spread of European control often provoked unrest, as colonial powers underestimated the determination and resilience of those they sought to govern. In many territories, resistance began as spontaneous, localized uprisings. Communities that had lost their lands, leaders, or livelihoods to colonial policies often responded with armed rebellion. In West Africa, for instance, numerous groups resisted French expansion through direct conflict. Leaders such as Samori Touré in present-day Guinea led protracted wars against the French, skillfully organizing armies and using guerrilla tactics to delay or halt colonial advances. These efforts, though eventually subdued by superior firepower, demonstrated the deep-rooted opposition to foreign domination and the strategic capabilities of African resistance movements. Even after military defeat, opposition continued through passive resistance, including tax refusals, desertion of colonial labor projects, and the preservation of indigenous customs. Rebellions were not only a reaction to territorial loss, but also a response to social and economic grievances. Colonial systems often imposed harsh taxes, forced labor, and land expropriation, causing widespread hardship. The imposition of foreign laws and disruption of traditional leadership structures further fueled discontent. In places like Madagascar, the Menelamba Rebellion of 1895-1897 represented a broad-based uprising against French colonial rule, rooted in both religious and nationalist sentiments. Participants sought to reclaim autonomy and restore cultural integrity in the face of European intervention. Similar revolts occurred in Southeast Asia, where resistance to French and British colonialism drew strength from historical traditions of independence and local governance. Religious movements also played a significant role in mobilizing anti-colonial sentiment. In several regions, spiritual leaders emerged as key figures in organizing resistance. They appealed to the faith and identity of their communities, providing a unifying force against the cultural imposition of colonial powers. These religious-based rebellions, while often lacking centralized military coordination, inspired collective action and helped sustain resistance over time. In some instances, colonial authorities responded with brutal repression, using overwhelming force to crush uprisings and deter further challenges to their authority. However, repression often deepened resentment and fostered a long-term legacy of opposition. The role of women in resistance should not be overlooked. Although often marginalized in historical records, women participated in revolts, provided logistical support, and preserved cultural values under colonial rule. Their involvement was critical to maintaining morale and ensuring the continuity of resistance movements, even in the face of military defeat. In some areas, women led protests against labor conscription and economic exploitation, challenging both colonial power and traditional gender roles. These actions underscored the wide reach of anti-colonial sentiment and the diverse forms it could take across different societies. Rebellion took on many forms, not limited to open conflict. Intellectual and cultural resistance also emerged as colonized people began to articulate their struggles through literature, political thought, and education. Colonial subjects who studied abroad or within missionary schools sometimes used their knowledge to critique colonial systems and advocate for reform or independence. Newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches became tools of resistance, spreading awareness and building solidarity among oppressed populations. Over time, these efforts contributed to the growth of nationalist movements that would later lead to formal struggles for independence in the 20th century. The history of resistance and rebellion in the colonies reveals the complexities of imperial rule and the enduring spirit of those who refused to accept subjugation. Despite the vast resources and military strength of colonial powers, they were never fully secure in their control. The colonized continually sought ways to assert their rights, protect their cultures, and reclaim autonomy. The role of the Empire in World War I. The role of the Empire in World War I was both vast and significant, influencing the course of the conflict and shaping its global dimension. When war broke out in 1914, the European powers drew heavily upon their overseas empires for manpower, resources, and strategic advantage. France, Britain, and other imperial nations depended on their colonies not only for economic support but also for soldiers who would fight alongside European troops in distant theatres of war. The conflict, though triggered by events in Europe, quickly expanded into a global confrontation due to the reach of imperial territories and the commitments of colonial governments. The empires turned to their colonies as essential components of the war effort, mobilizing people and material to sustain long campaigns on multiple fronts. In the case of the French Empire, colonies across Africa and Asia played an essential part in contributing to the military and logistical demands of the war. Thousands of soldiers were recruited from territories such as Senegal, Algeria, Tunisia, and Indochina. These colonial troops, known as tirailleurs, were deployed to European battlefields, where they fought in harsh conditions and against formidable enemies. Many of them had little knowledge of the politics behind the war, yet they served with courage and loyalty. Their involvement was a clear demonstration of the interconnectedness of empire and warfare, as conflicts in Europe required the support of people from distant lands who had been brought into the imperial fold. Colonial soldiers faced unique challenges, including unfamiliar climates, racial prejudice, and the psychological toll of fighting in foreign lands. Despite their contributions, they were often treated unequally compared to European troops, receiving lower pay, inadequate medical care, and limited recognition. Nevertheless, their participation was vital to the success of many military campaigns. Beyond the battlefield, colonies also supplied food, raw materials, and labor. Agricultural products, metals, and other resources were extracted from colonial economies to support the war industries in Europe. Ports and transport networks in the colonies were used to move troops and goods, highlighting the strategic importance of imperial infrastructure during wartime. The war also led to significant changes within the colonies themselves. Wartime demands accelerated social and economic transformations. Many colonial subjects were exposed to new ideas, technologies, and political concepts as a result of their participation in the global conflict. Those who served or worked in support of the war effort returned home with different perspectives and a greater awareness of their role in international affairs. This experience planted the seeds of political consciousness and future nationalist movements as people began to question their status within the empire and demand greater rights and recognition. imperial competition also played a role in shaping the objectives of World War I. Beyond the immediate goals of defeating enemy nations, the major powers also sought to expand or protect their colonial possessions. German colonies in Africa and the Pacific became targets for Allied forces, who quickly moved to seize them at the onset of hostilities. The idea of empire was not just a background feature of the war, it was a key motivator for military and diplomatic strategies. Victory was seen not only as a matter of survival, but as an opportunity to reshape global empires in favor of the victors. After the war, the contributions of the colonies were acknowledged in various ways, though often without meaningful reform. France and Britain promised reforms and political concessions, but these were frequently delayed or limited. The disappointment among colonial populations over broken promises contributed to rising unrest and demands for independence. World War I thus served as both a demonstration of imperial unity and a catalyst for its eventual unraveling. The sacrifices made by colonial peoples were real and substantial, and their legacy lived on in the movements that followed. In summary, the empire played a crucial role in World War I, providing manpower, materials, and strategic depth to the European powers. The global nature of the war was inseparable from the reach and influence of empire, and colonial involvement proved indispensable to sustaining the conflict. Yet, the war also revealed the tensions within imperial systems and exposed the contradictions of ruling over diverse peoples without offering them equality. The experience of war reshaped both empire and colony, leaving a lasting impact on the century that followed. Nationalism and revolt in the interwar period. The interwar period, spanning the years between World War I and World War II, witnessed a marked rise in nationalism and revolt across many parts of the colonial world. The end of the First World War left empires strained and populations more politically aware, creating an environment conducive to resistance. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, nationalist sentiments emerged more forcefully as colonized peoples sought self-determination, fairness, and the end of foreign control. Promises made by imperial powers during the warmony involving political reform or increased autonomy were often unfulfilled, causing deep frustration and giving rise to organized movements. The post-war settlements, particularly the Treaty of Versailles, reinforced colonial dominance rather than dismantling it. Instead of granting independence, these agreements frequently transferred control of colonies among victors, intensifying the feeling of betrayal in the colonized world. Nationalist movements were shaped by a mix of cultural revival, economic distress, and global political shifts. The economic depression of the 1930s worsened already challenging conditions in many territories, pushing more people toward protest and organized resistance. In India, the independence movement gained significant strength under Mahatma Gandhi, who championed non-violent civil disobedience as a means of challenging British authority. Mass boycotts, strikes, and peaceful protests became powerful tools in the hands of a growing movement that crossed class and regional boundaries. Gandhi's vision of peaceful resistance, combined with a call for self-rule, inspired others facing colonial domination. In North Africa, countries like Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco saw the formation of nationalist groups seeking cultural and political rights. These movements emphasized local identity, language preservation, and rejection of imposed assimilation. French policies aimed at integrating colonies into a broader French identity were met with growing resistance, particularly as local populations saw their traditions and autonomy threatened. Nationalist leaders, many educated under colonial systems, used political tools, publications, and civil organizations to challenge colonial rule and demand reform. These early efforts laid the foundation for future campaigns for independence. The Middle East also experienced significant unrest during this time. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, new mandates in Iraq, Syria, and Palestine placed these regions under British and French control, despite earlier promises of independence. The result was widespread dissatisfaction and organized resistance. The 1920 revolt in Iraq and uprisings in Syria and Palestine reflected the growing unwillingness of local populations to accept continued foreign dominance. Nationalism in these areas often combined modern political thought with traditional leadership, resulting in dynamic movements demanding both independence and preservation of cultural heritage. In sub-Saharan Africa, resistance was more localized but still potent. Grievances over land seizures, labor exploitation, and heavy taxation fueled numerous protests and revolts. In West Africa, movements combined peaceful petitions with acts of defiance. Religious figures, local chiefs, and emerging political activists played crucial roles in mobilizing communities. Education and the return of veterans from World War I helped spread political awareness and new ideas. The interwar period marked a gradual shift from isolated resistance to more cohesive nationalist organization as political consciousness expanded. Elsewhere in Asia, movements in Vietnam, Indonesia, and China intensified. In Vietnam, nationalists began building secret networks to resist French rule. Influenced by a blend of Marxist ideas and strong anti-colonial sentiment. In Indonesia, anti-Dutch efforts gained momentum as political groups and youth organizations called for national unity and freedom. These movements were often met with strict repression, including arrests and censorship, but they endured and adapted. The rise of global ideologies, such as socialism and anti-imperialism, gave colonized peoples a new vocabulary and framework for organizing their struggles and demanding change. The interwar years marked a turning point in the history of colonial resistance. Across regions, colonized peoples began to see their struggles as part of a global movement against oppression. Though many revolts were suppressed, they fostered stronger nationalist identities and long-term political engagement. These movements questioned the moral authority of empire and asserted the rights of nations to govern themselves. The seeds planted in this period would grow into larger, coordinated independence efforts in the decades that followed, signaling the slow but steady decline of colonial rule around the world.